There comes a point in life when you realize that trusting family too much can cost you more than you ever imagined. My name is Alicia Bennett. I am 34 years old and I built my life around independence because I learned early that peace only exists when you protect your own space. I worked hard to live alone, to control my home, and to believe that the people closest to me would never cross a line once it was clearly drawn. That belief collapsed the night I walked through my front door and saw unfamiliar bags leaning against my wall, unfamiliar shoes lined up by my entrance, and boxes placed neatly beside my furniture, as if someone had calmly decided that my home no longer belonged only to me. My chest tightened when I realized that my mother had used her key to bring my unemployed sister into my house without my permission, not to visit, not to talk, but to move in as if they had the right to live there. I stood in the middle of my living room and said, without raising my voice, "You don't get to live here. This is my house." What I received in return was not fear, not apology, not shame, but quiet expectation, as if this outcome had already been decided. I picked up my phone, my hand steady even though my heart was not, and said to the operator, "There are people inside my house who entered without my consent and they refuse to leave." The police arrived, their voices low, their movements calm, and I stood in the hallway watching them being escorted out of the life I had built for myself. I thought it was over. But 2 days later, I woke up to the sound of sharp metal scraping against my front door, and when I checked the security camera, I saw my mother standing outside with a locksmith. I watched him work his tools into my lock as if it were allowed, as if it were normal, as if she had never been told no. I did not hesitate. I did not panic. I picked up my phone and made the call calmly because by then I understood one thing very clearly. Some people will never stop unless you force them to. If you have ever had someone cross your boundaries simply because they share your blood, subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share your story in the comments. What happened next was far worse than you think. Years before everything collapsed, my life was already pulling away from the people who raised me. Independence did not come to me as a sudden decision. It grew slowly from years of learning what happened when I relied too much on anyone. I watched promises break, expectations shift, and affection turn into obligation. So I started building a life that belonged only to me, one quiet step at a time. I worked long hours, saved every extra dollar, skipped comfort, skipped shortcuts, and chose loneliness over dependence because loneliness felt honest. The distance between me and my mother Linda did not come from anger. It came from pressure that never had a name. Every question felt like inspection. Every suggestion felt like instruction, and every silence felt like disappointment carefully wrapped in concern. I found myself measuring my words around her, adjusting my choices, shrinking parts of my truth, just to keep the air from becoming heavy. My sister Rachel had always existed on the edge of my world, close enough to see what I built, distant enough to misunderstand it completely. She moved through life like something would eventually catch her, something would fix things for her, something would arrive in time. I learned not to speak about my progress because any success sat between us like a silent accusation that neither of us wanted to name. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic fights, only quiet tension that lived in long pauses, side glances, and conversations that ended too early. By the time I bought my home with my own savings, I no longer felt like celebrating. I treated it as a private milestone because happiness felt fragile in a house where control often dressed itself as care. The spare key was never about trust in the romantic sense of family closeness. The night I handed it over, I looked directly into my mother's eyes and made the terms clear without hesitation, without smiles, without comfort padding. That key was meant for emergencies, only real emergencies. Moments when I could not be reached, when something serious had happened, when waiting was not an option. It was not for visits. It was not for convenience. It was not for decisions that did not belong to her. She held the key quietly in her palm, nodded once, and said nothing else. At the time, the silence felt like agreement. I believed that boundaries had finally been understood. I did not know that understanding and acceptance are not the same thing. 2 months before everything exploded, the air around my life began to feel heavier in a way I could not immediately explain. I did not learn about Rachel's housing situation from Mom, and I did not hear it from Rachel herself. The information reached me through a relative who mentioned it casually during a conversation that had nothing to do with family conflict, which somehow made it feel more real and more alarming at the same time. I was told that Rachel no longer had stable housing, not as gossip, not as a warning, but as a quiet fact, the kind of truth that sits in the back of your mind, no matter how hard you try to ignore it. Rachel did not call me. She did not send messages asking for help. She did not appear at my door asking for permission. Instead, her presence appeared around me without her ever stepping inside, like a shadow that slowly stretched across a wall until you noticed it was already there. I felt it through the way Mom began showing up more often, not to spend time with me, not to talk about my life, but to walk through my space with eyes that studied instead of admired. Mom began to treat my home like a place that needed evaluation rather than respect. She opened doors I usually kept closed. She stood silently in the hallway longer than necessary. She looked at the spare room in a way that made my skin tighten slightly, even though she had not yet said anything openly. Her voice stayed soft, but her intentions started to feel louder than her words. One afternoon, while she stood near the doorway of the guest room, she said something that felt simple on the surface but heavy underneath. She looked around calmly and said, "No one should live alone in a house like this." The tone was gentle, but there was something inside that sentence that shifted the balance of the room. It was not a suggestion. It felt like a test. I did not argue. I did not accuse her of planning anything. I did not raise my voice or challenge her in that moment because I understood that real intentions are rarely revealed when someone feels threatened. Instead, I started to observe her more carefully, noticing how often her gaze returned to the same spaces, how frequently she mentioned safety, loneliness, and responsibility in conversations that were never meant to be about any of those things. The longer this continued, the more I began to feel that this was no longer about concern. It felt like preparation. It felt like positioning. It felt like small movements being made quietly before a larger decision was forced into the open without my consent. By the end of that period, I understood something important, even though I had no proof yet. The attention Mom showed toward my home did not come from love or protection anymore. It came from a direction I had not agreed to, and from a plan I had never been asked to be part of. Not long after that, during a work trip, I began to feel a familiar sense of unease, the kind of feeling that usually appears just before something quietly falls apart. The trip itself was related to real estate, a series of property evaluations I had been managing for weeks, which meant long inspections, paperwork, and constant movement between buildings that all looked similar, but demanded different levels of attention. I had planned to stay away longer to finish everything properly, but the uneasy pressure in my chest grew stronger with each passing night, so I decided to return early without telling anyone. When I opened my front door, the air inside the house felt unfamiliar, even though nothing looked obviously destroyed. There were boxes stacked near the wall that I knew did not belong to me, bags sitting near the entryway that had never been there before, and objects placed carefully, as if someone had planned their positions rather than dropped them in a hurry. The arrangement was calm, almost respectful, which somehow made the situation feel more invasive instead of less. I moved further inside with slow steps, trying to understand how everything could feel occupied without looking chaotic, and that was the moment Rachel stepped into view. She did not look startled. She did not look ashamed. Her posture was relaxed in a way that suggested she believed she had every right to be there. I asked her what she was doing inside my home, not in a raised voice, not in a desperate tone, but with the quiet pressure of someone trying to keep control of their own reality. She looked at me and said, "Mom said it was already handled." That sentence stayed in the air longer than anything else she could have said because it answered nothing while explaining everything at the same time. I understood in that moment that this was not a misunderstanding, not a mistake, not an awkward family favor, but a decision that had been made without my presence, my permission, or my consent. As I walked further through my own house, I began to notice how precise the changes were. My belongings had been shifted slightly to make room. Drawers had been reorganized. A spare space that I had kept intentionally empty had been prepared to serve a different purpose. The clarity hit me slowly, not as fear but as something sharper, because I realized that the emergency key I had given for protection had been used as a tool of access, not safety. I did not fall into old emotions. I did not collapse into shock. I did not panic in ways I once might have. What I felt instead was a clean and controlled understanding that my privacy had been taken from me in a way that could not be explained as care. My home had turned into a shared space without my agreement, and that was a violation I could not ignore or soften. Rachel moved around the space, casually touching surfaces, adjusting items, behaving like someone who had already moved in rather than someone waiting for approval. I watched the way she placed her things without asking, the way she walked without hesitation, the way she spoke without concern for reaction. In that moment, I understood that the key had never been about emergencies. It had become a quiet permission slip that I never meant to give. I stood there without shouting, without pleading, without begging for reason, because respect does not live in arguments when the boundary has already been broken. What mattered was not the conversation. What mattered was the line that had been crossed without hesitation. By the time I left that room, my mind felt clearer than it had in a long time, because I knew that whatever came next would not be about emotion, family, or compromise, but about ownership, control, and a line that could no longer be treated as negotiable. The next morning, I realized I was done negotiating. I stood in the living room facing Mom without the softness I used to carry whenever she crossed a line, because something inside me had shifted overnight into a clarity that felt heavier than fear, but steadier than anger. I told her that ownership was not a feeling, not a suggestion, not a flexible idea shaped by blood or history, but a legal and personal reality that no one was allowed to touch simply because they shared my last name. Then I asked her to leave in a voice that did not rise and did not shake. Rachel stepped into the room, slowly carrying the kind of dissatisfaction that stretched the moment longer than it needed to be, using quiet sighs and wounded expressions to press against me instead of offering real words, creating a tight emotional pressure that wrapped around the air like something physical rather than spoken. She spoke about family in a way that treated guilt as obligation, making the space feel suffocating instead of conversational, while I remained still and refused to soften the boundaries I had already spoken aloud. I told them clearly that the emergency key was not permission, not access, not an open door for comfort or assumption, explaining that it existed for danger, only for real threat, for situations where life or safety was at risk, not for convenience, control, or silent decisions made in my absence. I said that using it without fear or consent was not helping a family member, it was trespassing, and the word hung in the room in a way that could not be taken back. The thought of calling 911 did not arrive as panic. It arrived as a slow and deliberate process that moved through guilt, memory, hesitation, loyalty, fear, and something deeper that I had not allowed myself to feel before, which was relief. I thought about everything I had compromised in the past to avoid conflict, about how often I had swallowed my own discomfort to preserve peace that was never real, about how the idea of dialing those numbers felt like betrayal and survival in the same breath. My hands did not shake when I held the phone yet. My chest felt like it carried every argument I had avoided across the years, every apology I made for things that were not my fault, every moment where I let silence replace truth, because it felt safer at the time. I realized that staying silent had never protected me. It had only trained them to step further into my space with confidence. When the police arrived, their voices were calm, their movements measured, and their presence carried the neutral weight that comes with authority that does not take sides immediately. They asked to see documentation, reviewed ownership papers, checked identification quietly, and spoke to each of us separately without raised volume or visible judgment, creating a strange stillness that made the situation feel official in a way that words alone never could. One officer explained to Mom that entering without consent carried legal consequences, even when family was involved, choosing words that sounded like caution rather than punishment, which made the moment feel unfinished rather than resolved. There was no handcuff, no dramatic removal, no final consequence, only a formal warning that hung in the air like a clock that had started ticking instead of stopping. When they left, the house felt larger, quieter, heavier, and more honest, because something fundamental had changed inside me that could not be undone by apologies, excuses, or promises, and I understood that this was not the end of anything, only the first time I chose myself without asking permission. 2 days later, the sound that woke me did not feel dramatic, but it felt wrong in a way that made my body react before my mind caught up. Metal tapped softly at first, then scraped along the frame of my front door in slow, careful movements that had nothing to do with accident or coincidence. I stayed still in bed for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling while my heartbeat rose steadily in my ears, trying to decide if I was imagining the noise or if someone was truly outside touching my door. I reached for my phone without turning on the light, opened the security app, and brought up the live camera feed from the front porch. The image was clear because the motion light had already triggered. Mom stood close to the door, her posture calm, arms folded loosely across her chest. Beside her was a man I had never seen before, crouched low with a small black case open near his knees. His hands worked with thin metal tools that slipped inside the lock with a confidence that came from practice, not from curiosity. Mom did not look nervous, rushed, or defensive. She looked patient, as though she were waiting for a repair job to be finished rather than standing inches away from committing a crime. That quiet confidence scared me more than the tools did. There was no shouting, no arguing, no pleading, only the sound of metal working against metal. I moved slowly through the hallway, keeping my footsteps controlled so the floor would not betray me. I stayed far enough back from the door to remain unseen, but close enough to feel the vibration each time the tools scraped the mechanism. My hands felt heavy while holding the phone, but I knew what I had to do. When I called 911 the second time, my voice did not shake at first. It felt steady in my throat, almost practiced, as I gave my address and explained that someone was actively trying to enter my home. My fingers began trembling only after the operator asked me who the person outside might be. Saying the word mother out loud felt like pushing a blade through my own chest. The familiarity of reporting someone who had once held my hand as a child made my stomach tighten, yet the fear of what she was doing pushed me forward. The operator asked me to stay on the line. I stayed silent while the sounds at the door grew more deliberate. The man shifted his weight and adjusted his tools. Mom stepped closer to him, said something I could not hear. Her face never changed. Red and blue lights painted the front of my house in slow flashes before I ever heard the sirens. This time, the arrival felt heavier. Commands came through sharp voices amplified by the quiet street. I watched through the camera feed as the officers moved fast, weapons drawn, ordering the man to drop his tools and lie face down on the ground. He froze for a fraction of a second before obeying, arms stretched out and cheek pressed against the concrete. Mom was pulled several steps away from the door. One officer kept a hand lightly but firmly around her arm, while another spoke into a radio and began writing on a clipboard. There was no friendly tone this time, No casual warnings, no soft explanations. Everything moved like a machine that had finally been dropped into a higher gear. I stayed behind the locked door while it all unfolded. I did not step outside. I did not open the lock. I stood there listening to muffled voices through thick wood, listening to the sound of paper shifting and pens scratching while something official was being created in my name. Through the camera, I saw Mom speaking firmly, still composed, still convinced that whatever she was doing belonged within her rights. Her face showed irritation rather than shame. In that moment, something inside me shifted without ceremony. There was no explosion of emotion, no dramatic thought. I understood quietly and completely that she was not going to stop. This was not a misunderstanding that could be explained away. This was not a mistake born from worry or concern. This was a pattern that had crossed into danger. I remained still until the lights faded and the sounds of doors shutting echoed down the street. Only then did I lower the phone from my shaking hands and breathe again fully. I did not feel victory. I did not feel sadness. I felt clarity, and that clarity was colder and heavier than anything I had felt before. 1 week later, I stopped believing that silence meant peace, because silence began to feel like a place where plans could hide. I started cleaning through the last of the items that had been left behind, not because I wanted to preserve them, but because I needed to remove every trace that did not belong to me. Inside a thin cardboard box that had been pushed to the back of a hallway closet, I found a sealed envelope that did not have my handwriting on it. The paper felt heavier than normal, the kind of weight that made my fingers tense before I even opened it. Inside were printed forms that carried my name, my address, my signature, and descriptions of long-term residential permission that I had never applied for or approved. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was a misunderstanding, but the longer I looked at the lines, the spacing and the looping strokes at the bottom, the clearer it became that the handwriting was not mine. That night, I made an appointment with my lawyer, Daniel Harper, because this no longer felt like a family problem that could be talked through quietly. From that moment forward, I referred to him only as Daniel, because I needed someone who saw this as law, not emotion, and I needed someone who would not soften the edges of what was happening. Daniel sat across from me quietly as he reviewed each page, moving slower with every document, and the way his jaw tightened told me more than any words could have. He explained to me that if those papers had ever been filed even partially, someone could have argued that I had given legal permission for another person to establish residence in my home, which could have opened the door to property disputes that might take years to unravel. He told me that in situations like this, silence is often the most dangerous response because it allows false documents to grow roots inside legal systems before the real owner even realizes something has been planted. He explained that this was no longer about hurt feelings, broken trust, or emotional boundaries, but about protecting ownership intent and legal control over what I had built with my own effort. As I listened, something shifted inside me because I finally saw the shape of the entire situation clearly. This had never been about letting Rachel stay for a while, and it was never about Mom trying to help in the way that parents sometimes do. This was a slow, deliberate movement toward control, one that relied on guilt, pressure, and assumptions rather than permission or truth. I felt something steady replace the confusion in my chest, because I understood that if they had been successful, I might have woken up one day inside a home that no longer legally belonged to me in the way I believed, tangled inside courtrooms instead of hallways, trying to prove that my life had been taken without my consent. That was the moment I decided there would be no more conversations, no more explanations, and no more attempts to repair something that was not broken by accident. I stopped responding to messages. I stopped acknowledging calls. I stopped leaving room for doubt inside my own mind. With Daniel's guidance, I began preparing formal documentation that would protect the property, block any attempt to file residency claims, and create a clear legal record that I had never granted permission for anyone else to gain rights over my home. I worked through each step carefully because this was no longer emotional work. It was structural work designed to protect the foundation of my life. For the first time since everything began, I no longer felt small or confused, because clarity replaced hesitation and preparation replaced fear inside my chest. A quiet sense of control settled in my thoughts, giving me steadiness instead of panic, certainty instead of confusion, and direction instead of doubt. I understood that whatever came next would not catch me unguarded, because I was no longer simply reacting to their actions. I was actively building boundaries that could not be crossed quietly or dismantled in the dark. Several months later, life no longer felt fragile inside my own walls. It felt quiet, structured, deliberate. That quiet did not come from forgiveness, closure, or emotional repair. It came from paperwork, courtroom signatures, and the kind of legal language that leaves no space for negotiation. Mom faced administrative penalties after the second documented incident was fully reviewed. The result was not symbolic. She received formal sanctions, was legally prohibited from approaching or interacting with any property connected to my name, and permanently lost any right to request, file, or interfere in housing-related decisions that involved me. There were no dramatic scenes in that process, only forms, hearings, verifications, and a steady removal of influence that had no path to return. Rachel was forced to leave the city quietly, without the ability to establish residency or continue any unlawful presence. She had no protection left, no structure to lean on, and no remaining path to stay nearby. The reality that followed her was simple and unprotected. She had to solve her own life without borrowed authority, without hidden access, without someone speaking on her behalf. I did not track where she went. I did not need to. Distance created its own form of conclusion. Inside the house, everything physical changed. I replaced every lock. I reinforced every entry point. The security system was redesigned and extended. Cameras covered angles I never thought I would need when I bought the place. Motion detection became layered, alerts became instant, access became singular. Through my lawyer, I established clear legal boundaries that existed on paper and inside official registries, so that no claim, no signature, no attempt at residency could be attempted quietly again. That process changed something in me that could not be reversed. For a long time, I believed family meant tolerance, patience, and emotional endurance. I learned that unprotected empathy allows people to cross limits without fear. I learned that allowing repeated access in the name of blood creates danger that grows in silence. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are structure. They are safety. They are self-respect. No relationship, no title, no shared history justifies the removal of your right to feel safe where you live. Protecting yourself is not betrayal. It is responsibility. If you stayed with this story until the end, I want to thank you with sincerity. Your time matters. Your attention matters. If you have ever experienced someone using closeness as a way to push into spaces that should have remained yours, you are not alone. You are not dramatic. You are not wrong. You deserve peace in your own life. If this story resonated with you, feel free to share your experience in the comments, or use this space as a reminder that you are allowed to protect what belongs to you.